So welcome everyone to this session this morning. We are very pleased to have with us Elder Metropolitan Emmanuel from the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Elisabetta Kikanovic from the Council of European
Recording
Churches.
in progress.
For those of you who weren't here yesterday, this is a session that is jointly sponsored by several groups, including the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University, the G20 Interfaith Forum, and I'm sure I may be leaving out some others. Oh, the CAICID, yes, I have to express thanks for CAICID being with us and joining in this effort. So, it's my privilege at this point to introduce first, we'll be hearing from Metropolitan Emmanuel, and then following him, we'll turn time over to Elisabetta Kikanovic. And I think without taking more of the speaker's time, I'll just turn things over to them and let them begin. So.
Thank you, Professor, distinguished participants, those being here with us at this room, and also those who are participating from far away. And dear friends, it's a great pleasure, and thank you very much, Professor, and the organizers for inviting me at this meeting, where we're going to hear for the protection of sacred spaces throughout the world. And I'm very pleased also that CAICID, where I'm on the board, is sponsoring this meeting as well. It is an undisputed reality that the great majority of human experience and the meaning making that flows from it rests in and is made tangible by sacred spaces in our world. Pointing to the smallest chapel upon a hill in the Aegean island, or a local shrine in the heart of India, to the great mosques of the Muslim world, or the soaring cathedrals of Europe, and even the sacred places that are not contained by space like the holy cities of Jerusalem and Mecca, sacred spaces can be found in every corner of the world, emulating the diversity of humanity and affirming our common aspiration for communion with the divine. Sacred spaces are set apart from the scene and turmoil of our world, and honor is granted to them on account of our conviction that such spaces are sites of revelation, memorial, pilgrimage, worship, and meditation. Nevertheless, the scene of our world has turned sacred spaces into contested sacred spaces that are defiled by political, fundamentalist, and nationalist agendas, and represents which has fomented a hardening of the hearts of humankind throughout the centuries, leaving these spaces and the faithful who enter into them unable to be purveyors of solace and grace. On the subject of sacred space, the Orthodox Church retains an enduring and deep understanding of the purpose and value of sacred spaces in imaging the body of Christ and the affirming that the kingdom of God is at hand. Any church building, be it in a great cathedral like Hagia Sophia or a parish church, a monastery secluded in the wilderness, or a chapel built on the side of a rural road, is a sacred space consecrated to God as a space where the kingdom is made manifest on earth by the congregation of the faithful and their reception into the mystery of mysteries, let's say the Holy Eucharist, and the other sacraments, of course. Further, every church is made sacred by having at its core, at the center of the altar, and it's very significant, what I'm saying is that fragments of relics of the martyrs or the saints of the church, thus proclaiming the Christian belief is in the resurrection of the dead and the sanctification of our souls and bodies through and in Jesus Christ. And in that manner, church buildings are sacred spaces, not on account of the structure itself, but what God offers to humanity as a proof of his love for all, and what humanity offers up to God for the life of the world. It is with this understanding of sacred space that the Orthodox Church affirms sacred space to be a profoundly liminal space of encounter and communion with one's neighbor, the whole of the creation, and God himself. And as such, the Orthodox Church believes that the sacred space should be protected in all societies, for it is a tangible site whereby individual and community faith, belief, and conviction is made manifest in the world. In our current moment and throughout human history, sacred spaces have nonetheless become sites of contestation, division, and anguish as religious groups seek to claim such spaces for themselves at the exclusion of others. And this contest over sacred spaces has given many license and perceived justification to alter the very meaning and purpose of sacred spaces as sites of revelation and reverence, instead perverting their value into that seeks absolutist possession in the sight of the sign of dominance over and at the expense and suffering of the other. Instead of preserving them as sites of encounter and communion, sacred spaces have for so long been swept up in the corrupt and disastrous dealings of politics and religious fundamentalism. We have seen, and we see that every day. We hear so much about the destruction of these temples or churches and or mosques, and the tragedy, for example, of Armenians in Antash, and the centuries-old Christian civilization they represent is an ongoing one. What does one gain by retaining sole access over a sacred space when access is denied to our neighbor who is of another denomination or faith? What does one gain when bickering over the rights of usage in a sacred space when all parties, in the end of the day, desire to revere and worship the divine? And what does one gain by closing the door to our neighbor instead of opening it to them and showing them that light that is found within? What is gained are things of this world, power, control, privilege, but nothing of the world that every faith aspires to, namely one filled with peace, love, and openness. In this reflection, a powerful account from the New Testament comes to mind when we recall the animosity and the relationship between the Jewish and Samaritan peoples in the Gospel of John with the Samaritan woman. Many may nonetheless forget how both communities, both the Jews and the Samaritans, built temples on two different mountains, one on Zion and all that of course we know, and the other one on the Mount of Gerizim, simultaneously claiming that both were the temple of the one true God. And as the existence of either temple questioned the legitimacy of the other and the revelation ascribed to each by the Jews and the Samaritans in the Jewish conquest of Samaria in around 110 BC, the Samaritan Temple of Gerizim was destroyed. And in this story, we can see much of ourselves in the Jews and the Samaritans as we look to delegitimize our neighbor by restricting access to and desecrating or destroying their sacred spaces, the well springs of faith and renewal. But why must we repeat the ills and suffering of the past if we know that all is fulfilled when we embrace our neighbor and seek connection with the divine? To that effect, while all people of all faiths still look to sacred spaces as bright lanterns placed on our hilltops, the lampstands of our world, sacred spaces cannot continue to be sites where faith is upheld in the exclusion of our neighbor. If that is the case, sacred spaces become shells of what they are meant to help reveal within us in our world. And as such, all people of goodwill must take up the mandate of protecting sacred spaces against denominational bickering, religious rivalry, and political exploitation. As the most tangible expressions of our faith and conviction found on our hearts of every God-bearing person, fearing person, sacred spaces should necessarily be protected by the freedom of religion and belief. And when a freedom of religion and belief is insufficient in protecting and ensuring equitable access to all in contested sacred spaces, the common humanity of all and respect for cultural heritage must be taken up as a starting point for any encounters that aim to ensure access to the sacred space and uphold interfaith solidarity. When governments and non-state actors move to politicize sacred spaces as makers of conquest or grievance, or in a clash of civilizations, or people of goodwill, and the international community at large must rally behind the necessity of preserving the physical and spiritual integrity of such spaces when alterations are made to conceal and erase history and religious heritage. I remember that the Conference of European Churches, when I was still at the presidency, this ecumenical organization held a conference called Towards the Universal Standards of Protecting for the Protection and Worship Places in 2017, and issued a very important communique on the legal status and protection of places of worship and holy sites, which I think is still relevant for all of us today. The final communique welcomed the increased public awareness of the importance of places of worship and holy sites as an integral part of freedom of religion and belief, as well as the relevance for the common cultural heritage of humanity, noting that such sites form an integral part of the people's integral historical and cultural, and their desecration or destruction can cause severe trauma. The United Nations Alliance of Civilizations work in pushing forward the United Nations Plan for Action to safeguard religious sites, and in unity and solidarity with safe and peaceful worship represents an important area of action and implementation. And work undertaken in the framework of the G20 Interfaith Forums Working Group on Sacred Sites has furthermore broadened discussions and thinking in this area. Dear friends, when conflict seems intractable or too long-standing to ever be overcome, those in power, being secular or religious leaders, must call upon their faith, the faith that they believe to be physically legitimized by the purity of the sacred spaces, and thus could be injured if the door were open to their neighbors to reaffirm this enduring truth. Sacred spaces are set apart from the world, not to be enclosed from it, but because they are sites where what was deemed impossible became possible, and what was unheard of was proclaimed, and what was unseen was made manifest to all. If we are convinced of the need to protect sacred spaces out of respect and honor for them, be manifestations of the faith and conviction of our neighbors, we must remain vigilant and empowered to call out for injustice and be ready to work for justice. And it's through vigilance and action that we all may deem worthy to count upon ourselves among those the church petitions during the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom refers as sanctity, who love the beauty of your house. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, Elisabetta.
Thank you. Okay. So, as Conference of European Churches, we have been rewarded by the EU funding from the Internal Police Fund for the protection of the worship places. And the consortium actually is first time we have built actually Interfaith European Consortium with the colleagues from European Jewish Congress, with the European Buddhist Union, Faith Matters, which is Muslim organization, and the Conference of European Churches. And the reason how we got there as KEC, first of all, we have been part of the working group who was discussing protection of the worship places and protection actually of the public spaces because there were some terrorist attacks in European Union and also in the wider Europe. In this regard, and European Commission wanted something to do in order to have some concrete action plan to support the protection of the public spaces. And what we have done as churches, we have been engaged, as Metropolitan Emmanuel said that during his presidency, in the conference on the protection, legal protection of the public and worship places and holy sites. And you can see that we have issued two publications. One is Places of Worship and Holy Sites in Europe and the Middle East, and another is Religious Diversity in Europe and the Rights of Religious Minorities. So in order to run this project, this project runs actually until 31st of March 2023. And the aim of this project was to develop content, videos, brochure, guidelines, guides, training material. And I have some here. You can also see this material for religious leaders and church leaders and church staff and the worshippers. And another document, it relates to religious literacy for law enforcement. This project is translated in 14 languages, this material, and we have the website related to this. So the question is, what do we want with this project? What is the purpose? So the point is that we wanted to encourage all religious communities, Muslim, Jews, Buddhist, any community, Christian, to report violation of religious freedom and attacks on the worship and holy places. And also you have here behind on the slide like typology, what one can report. It goes to online and social media abuse, insult and harassment. You know, many of religious leaders actually are maybe not aware that actually once they're in the public sphere, they take certain positions, they become human rights defenders because they protect and they speak up for protection of the human dignity, either of the individuals or in the community. And therefore, they actually also become a subject of the social and media abuse, insult or harassment and so on. So these are also the data that we collect for our monthly report that I will show you afterwards, as well as vandalism and graffiti, which we sometimes find on the worship places, and then desecration of the worship places and holy sites, theft, arson, kidnapping, violent assault, stabbing attacks, hostage-taking, car ramming, active shooter, and explosives. So anything which affects religious communities or the individuals, basically this is the data that we collect. And sometimes we have noticed that for religious leaders, it's difficult to, let's say, report these events because some of them they say, well, nothing will happen afterwards. The justice is very slow. The justice system doesn't work properly. We never find the perpetrator. Sometimes is okay. Let's be quiet and let's forgive because there is this sense of forgiveness coming from the deeply theological roots of our theologies. And so on. But if we don't know what is going on the market, then these violations of religious freedom and vandalisms of the worship places will never end. And the question is, how do we help the religious leaders when they need to take decisions, like on various issues and face, for example, with the damage which has also financial repercussions. So for the big religious communities, sometimes this is maybe not a big burden if they need to repair a facade, but especially for some small communities which are actually facing with graffiti on their buildings or on their windows, or the windows are broke, or the community is torn, or anything which has happened to interrupt the religious life of the individuals and the community, it becomes really a big problem. And the question is, who is going to pay for it? Because if we don't report, we are never going to find the perpetrator, and then there is never going to be, let's say, victims' compensation for these sort of acts. So this is where our team from Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and Christian background, we are going in 15 European countries and simply encouraging religious leaders in our own communities to report the crimes that they are facing on the monthly level. So there is very, very active reporting system, and this is how it looks like, our reporting system and the methodology that we have been using to, let's say, protect the worship and holy spaces and places, is that we have actually asked every church and every community, also religious, also the same system and methodology more or less applies to all the communities. In our consortium, that they need to establish post of the ambassador, somebody who on voluntarily basis is writing reports and takes maybe 2 hours of time per month and collects the data and sends us the data from the reliable sources. And the way that we have built this network within the communities also helps us to analyze better data, and also this is the data which comes from the people that we know. So what we want to also prevent actually is that there is fake data coming into our reports. So we want really reliable data coming into our reports, which is based on the issues which are happening in the communities. I will just go through a few slides what was reported to the Conference of European Churches. So what you will see for the churches, it exists also for the mosques, for synagogues, and also for the Buddhist temple in 15 countries, because we are targeting only 15 countries of the European Union right now in this project. So this is but of course, as Conference of European Churches, we are broader than the European Union in terms of the countries. We have about 40 countries, and we have allowed basically to everybody to report what is going on with their, let's say, worship places, sanctuaries, cemeteries, and so on. So this is, for example, just one picture what was sent to us and reported in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we have said that in our report that this is criminality because the graves cemeteries was broken and desecrated, and this was not the first time for this community in Ljubitova and Zenica to face with these issues. Then we have been witnessing in Montenegro quite very heavy demonstrations because of a dispute between two churches, Montenegrin Orthodox Church and the diocese or metropoly of the Montenegrin Littoral, who belongs to Serbian Orthodox Church. So, and we could see that one nationalistic part of people were standing with Montenegrin Orthodox Church, and then they have tried, for example, to destroy the stones, the bricks which were supposed to be built into the temple. And we know very much how expensive these bricks are. So once this is destroyed, of course, there is a cost after this. There was one political event which was coinciding with intronization of Metropolitan Ioanniki in Montenegro, where some parts of society did not want him to be intronized as a metropolitan, and they wanted to prevent him to use the roads to arrive to the monastery. So this is the case now in autumn, last autumn 2021, when there were barricades with the tires, and they were burning the tires. And then there were the riots because they didn't want this to happen. You can see the stones, how people prevented this metropolitan to enter to the monastery. And here you can see the reaction against the Serbian Orthodox community who was not supported to help intronization of this metropolitan, and also who was fighting for the law on freedom of religion or belief in Montenegro, which new law was foreseeing basically depriving property of the Serbian Orthodox Church and introducing the concept of French laïcité in this state, which simply does not work. And the dispute went over to the Muslim community in Montenegro, and then another aggressive community from Montenegro nationals, they were saying, well, second Srebrenica can happen also here. And this is where the Serbian Orthodox Church organized the protest, and you can see the priests with their bodies, they are protecting the mosque in Montenegro. And the words which are signed there are saying, we are not giving up our holy places and our worship places. So people were very solidary, even though there were riots around this religious freedom law. We could see correlation and coexistence between the communities, standing together when it was very, very difficult. On the end, Metropolitan, they found a way, because these were the roads blocked for him to access to the monastery, but somebody suggested that he take the plane, and they took military helicopter and then transfer him to the monastery, so intronization happened in that day without any instability, like in the country. So when something we want, there is always a way, as you say. So, as you know, also in the Kosovo in 1999, Serbian Orthodox community and Albanian community, they had big clash. There was ethnic cleansing done by Milosevic previously, then there was exodus of Serbian people, and then there was bombardment in 1999, and these were the monasteries who were destroyed. Now the story, this is, for example, data that we collected in one of the previous reports from MEP, who is in charge for the Kosovo affairs, Viola von Kramen. She was saying that Serbian Orthodox Church, because they are minorities, and that is very difficult when from majority you become minority in one geographical space, that is heritage in Kosovo and must be protected and enjoyed by full rights. This is just what she tweeted. And then there were also comments against this community, and they were saying that this is not Serbian heritage. So right now there is political dispute in Kosovo with Albanian, let's say, authorities, or let's say Kosovo authorities of Albanian origin, who are disputing the property and challenging them that does not belong to the, let's say, proprietaire, to the owner, which is Serbian Orthodox Church. Last year, we also witnessed the clash and battle in the region of Novgorod-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Armenians, they lost part of this territory where they have been residing for decades. And we can see this, let's say, church also being totally destroyed, windows broken, and so on. There is another attack of these worship places. Not to forget also Cyprus and division from 1974, where desecration of the worship places is also at stake. And these are just few glimpses, just to show how what Metropolitan Emmanuel was talking just previously about politicization and instrumentalization, and the way, what do we have if our neighbor is destroying our worship place. And also he was speaking about purpose and the value of the sacred places, how we as human beings actually can desecrate it. And this is very astonishing. To go back, for example, to France, because these are the countries that we are collecting this data, only last year, in 2021, there was in the investigation that 1,659 there were anti-religious acts in 2021. So you see the figures: 857 relate to Christianity, 589 relates to Judaism, 213 relates to Islam. So these are very, very high figures in 21st century, when we have actually all these laws on religious freedom. So you can imagine, if we don't have the law on freedom of religion or belief, what kind of data it would be there. And I really strongly believe that these figures, for example, in France, and of course this is figures which are recorded, are actually inviting for European Convention of Freedom of Religion or Belief. We need to have certain legal framework at some point, also protecting the rights of religious minorities, because that is really missing in this regard. So, as you know, a European Commission have started this project on the protection of the public spaces, because there were terrorist attacks in Europe, and some they were connected to the, let's say, religious fundamentalists, like terrorist attack in Berlin 2016, Barcelona 2017, London 2019, Paris 2019, Christchurch 2019, Vienna 2020, and so on. And there was an issue that something needs to be done in this regard, and this is where we have developed this training for churches and religious communities, because we wanted that the church and religious leadership is prepared in case something happened, because it's very hard for religious leaders. They are the one who needs to take decisions to protect their community, and the question is how. So this is one thing, and we have actually prepared this material. This is not only if there are terrorist attacks but any sort of attack. It can be also for example, if there is climate change and the river, for example, ruins the religious object or the worship place. It can be also crisis situation with like it was with COVID-19. And with what we are basically here advising communities is to create also crisis management team in every religious community, which can really work very well. And in one of the these pages, page 10, this material also, it is available online. You can have also the scheme of the crisis management team that you can build in your community. So you need to have a lawyer, psychologist, a medical assistant, a media coordinator who coordinates in case that something happens. Then monitoring, for example, the worship place with CCTV, adequate locks on the worship places, and so on. And of course that poses also lots of issues, because the laws in the countries of the European Union are different. In some countries, the community is not allowed to put CCTV because of monitoring and protection of human dignity of people. In some countries, it is possible. And that poses also challenges for religious leaders, how they cooperate with the authorities and so on. Sometimes authorities like law enforcement, they don't know anything about religion. We have talked about this many, many times about religious literacy, and here we go. So we have done something, small contribution on religious literacy. This is the book which has a chapter on Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, that we advised basically our church leaders and the staff to take this when they want to introduce with the local police, that we advise them that they know their local police, their fire brigade person in the quartier, to know also, for example, the medical service, to know the mayor and so on, as well as other parts of the establishment in society, what it's important to solve one crisis situation. So we have translated this, as I said, in 14 languages, and they can take this with them and actually establish the contacts in order to be just prepared to protect their own community. And here I stop. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you for this sort of tour through much of Europe, and the work you're doing with this grant looks like it's very, very helpful and very practical. I think there are just a number of things that we should be able to discuss, and we'll certainly open this up to the audience in due course. Let me perhaps start with you, Metropolitan Emmanuel. I think what came through in a very impressive way in your remarks is the importance of being able to share sacred space, which is, if this were always easy, it would solve a lot of the problems. I take it they've been working on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to share that sacred space for a millennium or two. Hasn't been easy. Often the situations are less tense than that, but sometimes they are that tense. But I would just sort of ask how you deal with something like this. Yesterday we had Peter Petkoff mentioned we were talking about the ability to share sacred spaces. And we had some examples of where a sacred space had been destroyed and another denomination would share their space. And Peter pointed out that that's not always possible. It may be problematic for canonical reasons. So if I understood correctly, the Anglican churches, once they're consecrated, can't just be turned over to other religious denominations. Although they found a sort of a clever workaround because they have a lot of vacant places and they could share the space to use as a community facility, just not as a worship place. So that, there were some things like that sort of went to your spirit of sharing. But how does one balance the places where it's not permissible to share? Are there ways that can be done in a way that doesn't inflame problems? How does one deal with that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, indeed, certainly when we talk about sharing, it comes also in mind the respect for the other. And definitely we go up to the point, it's not in the let's say in the Christian world, I would say it's more common that we have a shared space of worship, and where it's needed, definitely we welcome the other. So for Christianity, it's easier to do that, where definitely this could not be done with sharing a synagogue with Christians or with Muslims. And likewise, I think I have not seen any mosque being used, also as a church at the same time. We have seen mosques being turned, churches being turned into mosques, but I would say that the question is, first of all, for respect. We have, even during crisis, we have seen communities letting others to use, and even welcoming even the Muslims in some churches, even the Western countries welcome the communities. The question for me is to keep, and as Professor Petkov reminded us, there are canonical, let's say, rules that we have to respect, and we cannot go against them. But what I think that what I mentioned is that definitely, first of all, we have to respect what is a sacred space, which is sacred not only for my community, but for the whole world. I think what is sacred, and we do not discuss this. And if we have in mind, because I mentioned that this is a question of freedom of religion and belief. So if we have this in mind, we know where to go. And there are cases where we have in one, and there is more common, more and more, that we have a space for different religious communities in an area which is a common area for worshippers. And especially in some countries, in the Gulf, for example, now, it's coming more and more. It's becoming more evident that we have a space where the religious communities can worship in a certain area, especially Christian churches. And needless to remind of the initiative in Abu Dhabi, for example, for especially in the aftermath of the human fraternity document signed there, that there is a space for churches, for a synagogue, and for a mosque to be in the same area. This does not let us thinking that we endorse syncretism. So we have to be very much on this line that we know where our limits, we know what are the canonical boundaries that we have, but at the same time we know what is the freedom of religion and what is the respect for the other community. And if we think like this, we can definitely help with our faithful not to hear what we hear every day. We have, I remember still a couple of days ago, we had to endorse a statement again because of the attack in Africa, in Nigeria, if I remember correctly. I think, or a Sikh temple in Afghanistan. I think we need to have that in mind. And we have education is also something very important for our own people. We cannot go beyond that. As I mentioned, fundamentalism exists. We have to prevent that, and I wish we could prevent it before coming into effect.
So, yeah, I think this kind of general principle of respect is very important, and it can cut differently in different ways, or it can be manifested differently in different ways. For example, you mentioned Abu Dhabi. I know after the expo in Dubai, the expo area, land is being given to different churches, different denominations to build structures. And some of those structures would be exclusive within the structure, but they may have something else nearby.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way that the public can accommodate sacred space and make differences. I think different religious communities may have different senses of what's sacred and what needs to be kept exclusive and what is open to the public. That may be a part of understanding and respect and respecting the kind of autonomy that different religious communities have. I don't know what kind of experience you have.
Can I just add one word about, I remember it was probably around 99 or 2000 in Belgrade. The mosque, we have the center of Belgrade, we have the Serbian Orthodox Patriarchate, and very close is a synagogue and a mosque. And a mosque was destroyed, or there was an attempt of being destroyed by fire one evening. So journalists came to ask the local religious leader, who put fire in the mosque? And he said, I don't know who was the one, but I know who came to help me put this fire out. So this is important that, we do not always, think that one is against the other, but who comes to help and have the solidarity that I mentioned earlier.
I remember, this is just an example that's like that from my own community, and it goes to show that you sort of start building the relationships early. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in sort of the middle of Nigeria wanted to build a chapel. And one of the first things they did is, because there was a mosque nearby, so they went and talked to the people of the mosque, and the people of the mosque said, Christians have never asked us whether it would be okay to build nearby. And they said, yes, you can go ahead and build. So this chapel was built. Then a few years later, they started having some of the kind of explosive violence that you see in some of the Nigerian cities. And a group of people were coming with torches to burn down the church. And the Muslim people from the mosque came out and stopped them and said, these are our friends, don't burn this church. So that was very helpful. And I think sometimes we need to recognize and figure out how we build those kind of relationships so that so the respect starts even before the conflagration. So tell us, you've been dealing with a lot of these kind of situations. Do you have advice for these situations? How do you tell apart when you do have to respect the sort of the autonomy of a religious community and how they view their boundaries, and how one can share and make sure that doesn't become a flashpoint or a point of violence?
Yeah, well, I think that both of you have actually given excellent examples how one can actually deal in the crisis situation when there is an attack for one community. But the best is actually what you have said, Cole, that we know each other before. And we established these relationships, like before something happened. And I know how much Metropolitan Emmanuel have been over decades working on this relationship to establish for the Christian Orthodox world with also other religious communities. And we needed that. And we needed that also to these examples really to come to the grassroots level. That simply people are very encouraged seeing their leaders as an example, as somebody who leads by the example, to follow these great examples and so on. Because every religion, and we know that you have been quoting this maybe in one of our G20, that there were about 4,200 religions. Of course, it is the question how this figure came about on internet. There are many disputes about the methodology. And for example, we are here dealing only in this paper with 4. Mm-hmm. So, and then of course, every religion claims it is the right way. So, all of this, they're offering that as a, let's say, roadmap for salvation of our souls and internal life and so on. But still, we are humans. We are humans, and we should not forget that we are humans. And it is great that we have religious freedom on the legal level, because you can imagine if religious freedom would not be there, what would be, in which world we would live, how brutal that world would be. Really, with all these, let's say, great laws that we have here in Europe, still we have, for example, these terrorist attacks. Still we have provocations of religious communities. One thing that I have been observing now in the last years was, for example, that there was also provocation from the legal point of view by religious communities. For example, in 2018, there was a law to ban circumcision in Iceland. We have been working and supporting, even Christian community, we have nothing to do with circumcision or literal slaughtering. Legally, we have been supporting Muslim and Jewish friends, to preserve this right to practice freedom of religion or belief. Then, because of some disputes, with the foreign funding of mosques, for example, in the countries of the European Union, there was an act where certain states, We go to Bulgaria, to Peter's country of origin, where they started to introduce the draft law, for example, of preventing missionaries' work and different activities. Of course, there were, even though Bulgarian constitution is granting freedom of religion or belief in its full sense, and then this law was dropped. Last year we had a situation in Denmark when Danish authorities wanted to have a law where every sermon needs to be translated in Danish, and we have reactions from German Protestants in our own organization who say, sorry, we are Germans, we are living here for centuries in Danish soil, we don't want from German to translate in Danish. And that was not because of Germans, that was because of Muslim community, because they are providing sermon in Arabic. Now in France, let's say there is another act consolidating bill of the Republic, which is foreseeing scrutiny of religious community. Again, that was introduced by, I think, Minister of Interior. And of course, this is unconstitutional law. So, and now I think in August they're going still to discuss at Constitutional Court whether this law can survive or it's not. But it's likely that it violates really human rights and religious freedom. Not to go, for example, to Belgium, from where I'm coming from, the ban on the religious slaughtering, which is confirmed by European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. And now we have seen this issue because in favor, of course, this is the Belgium, it's a very secular country, and they want to prove that animal rights are also on the very high level. But then, of course, what do we do? Human rights or animal rights? You know, like it is really disparity. While we see that so many people are living in poverty, extreme poverty, without food, without water, without jobs, basic necessities, and so on, and now we put animal rights on such a high level where humans, in order to practice their own religion and belief, they cannot have nutrition, normal just nutrition, because they need halal and kosher food. So these are the disputes that we can see, and this is where I strongly believe that we need solidarity. You know, like to exercise this solidarity, because when religions goes all together to the legislature and to the political authorities, they can win much more in terms of the protecting religious freedom for all.
Yeah, so a lot does depend on leaders. I note that, well, it's been mentioned here that Metropolitan Emmanuel is on the board of CAICID, which is a dialogue center. The D in CAICID is for dialogue, and so that's one example of where dialogue can happen. One of the difficulties is that there are some areas where it seems impossible that you could talk to each other, but I remember taking a philosophy course as an undergraduate. It was a course on capitalism versus socialism. This was 1970, and it was a very popular course. And at the beginning of the course, Robert Nozick, who was one of the participants, it was Nozick and Walzer, but Nozick got up and he said, by the way, it's very good that we're going to talk to each other. Now, most of you would assume that if we talk together, we'll come closer together, but we might get further apart. That is, I suppose, a risk. I think most of us who have engaged in practical dialogue sessions find that we do come closer together. But sort of, are there some things that can facilitate that happening? Step one is getting some of the discussions to happen. Another thing you pointed out is getting them to happen not only at the level of top leaders, but at sort of the neighborhood level. How does one get that to happen? You're an expert on dialogue internationally.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get this to come down to sort of more local levels as you lead your own groups?
Thank you, Professor. I think the dialogue is an everyday process. We do not just keep the dialogue among experts or among religious leaders whenever they meet once in a while. Otherwise, we transform the dialogue in a professional, let's say, way, and doing the dialogue as a an issue of traveling around the world and doing just conference and sharing one's ideas. I think we start by doing the dialogue within our family, within our community, and pass the message from the pulpit to the pews. I think this is our message that we are, let's say, education starts, as I said, at home and goes on through the school and goes on through the community. We do not keep this as a secret in our own circle. And I think that our message to the communities, whereas Christians or Jews or Muslims or Buddhists, we have a responsibility as religious leaders how to prepare the next generation. And what is the message that we are teaching them? What is the message for tomorrow? And I think definitely we have all the possibility of changing the environment, but we have the society will not change unless we change ourselves. And I think this is I would say a movement that we see that starts from changing oneself, for listening, respecting the other, and learning how to live with the other. And more, in our societies, I think we have this now that we live in a pluralistic world. We see that countries where there was no possibility of having other religions or other traditions being present, this is more evident today. And we have to respect these communities. We have to be able to welcome the others in our own community, because this is the way that we're going to see the. Otherwise, it's not by law, definitely not. It's not by force, but it's because we have to become the hosts of the newcomers. That's how I see that the future could be definitely better when we learn that the neighbor is not my enemy, the other is not definitely my enemy, but the other is someone I look and I respect, and I see that this is someone that comes also from God.
Recognizing that we are all made in the image of God is a definite help, and it's rooted, and it can be talked about in secular terms using the notion of dignity and so forth. So I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind. Now let me just say, this is intended to be an open discussion, so if any of you have additional questions, I have quite a few that I can keep going with, but if some of you have questions, just signal, and would love to bring you into the conversation. But let me just ask.
Question.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you for those talks, Elizabeth. I've got a question for you. Ultimately, your constituents, the churches, and so on, you're asking trust from them, right? They are investing in your reporting mechanism, in your monitoring, and so on. Given that this is a European-funded project, what happens at the end of the project? And basically, how are there any plans to make it sustainable, locally owned, so that this burst of trust in the reporting mechanism is sustained afterwards? Do you have any plans in that direction?
Let me just make sure this is coming through the microphone for those online.
Yeah, that's an external microphone probably.
We can work on that, but just to repeat, that it's a question of trust, and how does one ensure that the trust is built during the project? How does that get continued afterwards?
Well, that is excellent question, and we have the same question. So the point is that we need to find a way how to continue this reporting also after the project is finished. So we are planning to have another application which is going to be like linked to these issues of violation of religious freedom and so on. Of course, I cannot disclose it now what we are planning to do, but we are foreseeing certain sort of continuation, and this is one thing. Another thing is that I believe that we build the trust with our communities, because this is non-politicized reporting. So, and it is very different, because we have received the information that when, for example, they report to the international organizations or to different centers, so the reports which are coming back to the headquarters are not reflecting the real picture on the ground. So what we are doing, we are trusting to our sources, and so we are not manipulating information at all. We found really good people who are very, let's say, punctual in the way that they're describing situations that they're facing on the ground, and we are copying this in the report. And of course, we just make sure that the information is clear, because somebody who reads first time in European Commission, they also don't know the vocabulary, like that we are using sometimes as churches and so on. So we are just making sure that the information is clear. But of course, to make it sustainable, it takes time. I will just say one thing. We as churches, when we enter into this project, we were quite behind with reporting, because the Jews, they're reporting 70 years because of the situation that they have been, and their experience in the political history of Europe. But then we have Muslim communities who are reporting since 9/11, because they have been the target, very heavy target, for violation of religious freedom and spreading anti-Muslim hatred. And we as churches and Buddhists, we are newcomers. And this also shows, maybe for the first time, that we as, let's say, predominantly Christian continent community, because European it's still, a Christian continent, predominantly Christian continent, that we can learn from minorities, from religious minorities, from their experience, the way they have been attacked. And this is, I think, happening first time. And we have to recognize the value, the experience, the knowledge that they share with us in a very, very, let's say, good way and unselfish way and so on. And actually sharing this experience, we actually moved from interreligious dialogue to interreligious cooperation and interreligious co-creation, because we were able to co-create this project together based on the experience of the religious minorities in the continent.
So, that reminds me of something. I talked a little bit yesterday about the hate speech paradox when we were talking about hate speech, and just the paradox to repeat is that one of the problems is you have legal protection regimes that are designed to protect minorities, but the minorities are afraid to invoke the protection because it will make them a lightning rod and attract further harassment. Whereas if the majority may use the law, if someone from the minority gets very frustrated and says something, that will get prosecuted because the people in the majority are not afraid. So I thought about this as a little bit as I was thinking about how you're training people and how this works. Do you have any idea, is there any way of telling how much those reporting are filtering things? Because most religious leaders that I know, if they're from smaller groups, will think about 10 times before they report something because they're afraid it will make it worse. And do you have protections that deal with that kind of problem? It's also an issue of how you train the people to do the reports. Yeah.
Yes, when the reporting comes and information comes to our desk, we are deleting all the names. So there are no names, except if somebody from European Commission wants to see it and is interested in. So there are no names. So basically the ones who are reporting.
Or no names of reporters. names of the churches.
Names
No.
of those who are reporting.
Reporting.
So of church leaders and religious leaders, this is all the same. This is also for the Muslim community. There are no names of those who are reporting. For Jewish also who are reporting anti-Semitism, or for Buddhist anti-Asian hatred and so on, or anti-Buddhist hatred. So there is, we don't put the names. We know who are they because we have built the database of the addresses and everything, and then we are also linked with intelligences in the European states who are also receiving this information, because this is actually working like an early warning system, because we want to inform the authorities before something happens. They know. And of course it is their task to connect the dots and so on, and this is not our task. We have our limitation in terms of capacities, human resources, but it is their task to put the dots together and then to help dealing with the situation.
Have you had any situations where I take it the people doing the reports may not be the leaders of the religious community?
They're not.
Yeah, so are there situations where the head of the religious community says, maybe we should just not report this, let's let it go quiet and solve it that way? Are there tensions that way in terms of how the reporting is handled? Tensions within the community as to whether something should be reported or not? I'll give you another an example of this. This is a more international example, but my understanding from talking to Coptics in the United States is they get very upset about what's happening to Coptics in Egypt, but the Coptics in Egypt don't want this being broadcast because it inflames their situation in the country. I'm thinking about those kinds of situations where there are tensions about what should be reported.
That, to be honest, we didn't receive some information like that, because the ambassadors, those who are reporting, they're nominated by the church leaders.
Mm-hmm.
They're nominated by their communities, and that means also that the church leadership has trust in its people.
Yeah.
And of course, what they are reporting is like linked to their community, because many of these events are actually already in public. When there is desecration of cemeteries or churches and so on, that is already, like you can see it the next day on the church website, on the website of the church, for example. There, like what has happened with some few words and with the photo. And what we are also asking is, when there is a reporting, that there is also evidence for it.
Mm-hmm.
But also, if they are not reporting it, we also receive this information that it's not reported to the police.
Ah, that's interesting.
So we
that
collect
report could
everything.
come in and say, this is information, please don't report it.
Yeah, no. There is information, for example, that, we had in Sweden, for example, some cases where it says, okay, for case A, B, C, police was informed. For case D, police was not informed.
Interesting.
And that depends from the community and how they feel about it. But as I say, as we are lacking human resources, we could open department on religious freedom to deal with this. But yeah, how many of these cases actually exist?
Yeah. Francis,
Just to say, it sounds amazing the experiences you've had with different communities working together. But quite often, we know sometimes religious communities attack one another. And I don't know, among those statistics, one pictures that quite a few people don't like religions in general, but often there may be things that happen between religions, also for geopolitical reasons and so on. When you're collecting statistics, is that something that one tries to report, like where these things came from, and how, when people report, of course, they must have a certain sense of the implications. If everyone were to discover that it was the Buddhists who were burning all the churches, there might be consequences. Not that is the case, of course. And how do you maintain the trust, knowing that the results could be, in some communities, quite difficult, and will need them to go and do more work with their own members?
So far, on our level, that did not happen. So on the church level. So, but I guess there are certain things which might be there, in the public sphere. So in that case, more what we are seeing is the tendency of the politicians And we could see during French elections now how the hate against certain communities went up and really, made really, like this hate speech in the public sphere really grow and so on. And then it's more this, let's say, trend that we are observing in the reports rather than community against the community. Usually there are individuals which like if they attack certain community, we call them lonely wolves, because today everything one can find on internet, how to build a bomb, how to build the like weapons and so on. And then they link this to certain ideology, but these people are not believers. We are aware of that. I mean, these people are not. If they would believe really in God and be true believers, like they would not do this. But I will take that question with me, Francis. Thank you, and I will ask around.
I hope it's not relevant, but it remains relevant.
So, Peter Petkov.
Well, thank you for those presentations and welcome to our sessions, Elder Emmanuel. We're very honored to have you here. There are two things which I thought were very interesting. So one is this focus on early warning, which is music to my ears because you missed some of the conversations yesterday because you missed your flights. But one of the things we're discussing about how, when we started this conversation with the British government, that they want to have more engagement on religious cultural heritage. They initially asked me to do something for them on protection of religious sites during armed conflict. And I said, and I'm not interested. And they were a bit shocked. And they said, why are you not interested? And I said, because if the British government is only interested in protecting religious sites during armed conflict, it's too late. And they can do very little. And then we started talking about what other things they could do at the time of peace to actually, before an armed conflict has started. And one of the things they really got excited about was the early warning. Because oddly enough, they haven't even begun to think about those things, which is, to me, is the most obvious thing. But here comes the challenge. Early warning has the same problem which Elder Emmanuel raised, that strategies about early warning could be designed by scholars in their ivory towers who do not necessarily speak to religious leaders or religious communities, or to religious leaders only and members of communities who don't necessarily speak to experts on the ground, which could be security experts, it could be lawyers, it could even be human rights specialists who do torture prevention strategies. And this is the thing, there isn't really a very obvious model which we have adopted in these areas in terms of having two or even three-tier system where religious leaders work with experts, work with policymakers, and it's a dynamic interaction rather than just inner circle conversations, which sometimes could miss a very important detail. And we had this with a project we recently did with churches which were under the control of the commissioners of the Church of England, because churches which are closed and no longer used as churches, they remain property of the Church of England, that usually transfer to the Church's Conservation Trust, but they cannot be used as churches, they can be used as full-time churches. And here comes the question here, what do you do with those buildings? And we tried to bring in an interfaith dimension to it. And the Anglicans were completely adamant that they don't want an interfaith dimension because they don't want other congregations to use the churches. And then we told them, well, but there are other ways to see that. So, for example, you could get other faiths to embrace the idea of Church of England as part of their cultural legacy and part of their cultural heritage. And let's try to figure out ways of doing so. So we spoke to some of the Jewish friends, and the Jewish friends said, no, we're not interested. We're not interested in sharing churches. We don't like the symbolism of the cross and the iconography of the churches, but we like the idea that the Church of England is in a way a guarantor for the religious liberty for all, including for those with no faith. So in that sense, for us, even for us, a church would have a meaningful effect. And as we were having this conversation, our friend Rabbi Naftali Rottenberg said, but that's not true. Christians are using synagogues and Jews are using Christian churches all the time. There is a legal model of how you do it, how do you sign contracts to have share use of churches and so on and so forth. So in different contexts, there will be different conversations, and you're going to have extremely opposite answers of how this could be done. And in a way, the bigger the circle is, where you have religious leaders who would give different perspectives, the greater the range of this preventive early warning approach is likely to come. And but the reality is that we haven't actually come up with this model, because a lot of those projects are completely isolated. They kind of work with a small circle of people. Another project takes Erdogan to court over Hagia Sophia museums. Another project deals with Armenian churches in Nagorno-Karabakh, but there hasn't been actually a consolidated effort to bring them all together in this kind of regional or even international level, where all those projects connect, and they also translate why are they important in a global scale, or what do they mean beyond the specific challenges and specific problems of the local communities. So it was more a comment rather than a question. Yeah.
So does it suggest things that can be done, or have you seen things like this? Either one of you.
Yeah, like Peter, we now in our project we have to do like 6 interfaith conferences, and this is exactly what you have. This is exactly the idea that we are trying to do, and it's going very difficult, I can tell you, because we were in Sweden, like last week, and we had a Jewish colleague expert and Buddhist colleague expert, and then because we were in Malmö, and Malmö it's a very problematic city. I see nodding from your side. So we went there to visit the synagogue, and we had Imam who came from Almanach project to talk to us about his project, and we had a rabbi from Israel who was also telling how they guided these communities in such a complex and complicated situation like in Malmö. But these projects we need to see more. This is what you're saying. I hear you saying, and of course now still we are in the COVID pandemic, okay, we are slowly getting out, but it is time that we on interfaith level we start really not only having a dialogue, but really this real cooperation and doing projects together. Because it's fascinating how much we can learn and the trust we can build. It's fascinating.
And how many different answers you could get on almost identical issues, which is good, but people have to be aware that there wouldn't be a simple answer.
We need to change the witness chair.
This is very embarrassing.
Okay. Cool.
I'm Matthew Lafferty. I'm from the Methodist office in Rome. Last month, the kind of two interrelated things. Last month, I was in London preaching in one of our preaching at one of our congregations, and they gave me a present. It was a book of the history of that congregation in London, and thinking about sacred space. Christians define sacred space in many different ways. In the tradition I come from, this congregation hosted the first sessions of the General Assembly of the United Nations were held in Methodist Central Hall in Westminster, which is a Methodist church, but also constructs what sacred space means in a very different way. Sacred space I think they wouldn't even use the word sacred space, but as a place of worship, there are sacred things that happen in that space. But what it calls to mind is that there are religious communities who would see their places of worship as being are either transient, so they're going to a place that's convenient for them, renting an apartment or renting a room that is either temporarily or permanently a place of worship. And I'm wondering, how do we protect the rights of communities to create sacred space in places that have not been traditionally identified as sacred spaces within the broader community in which they live, as well as thinking about helping communities who might see sacred space as being a particular building that's been in the neighborhood, who might be resistant to communities, religious communities coming in and creating new space, new sacred space or places of worship within their communities.
Yeah, let me just pick up on this myself, because I remember part of, for me, the importance of sacred spaces. I remember Elizabetha had me go to a conference in Cyprus, I believe it was. And suddenly I started realizing this wasn't just the Temple Mount and the Ayodhya Mosque, it was all kinds of smaller churches. But then I started thinking about how one builds smaller communities, and I thought of police raids on people reading the Bible in their homes in Central Asia, for example. So a very different scale of sacred space, but at the core of religious freedom in some way. So I think one has to think about the sort of the range of possibilities and what will make a place sacred for different groups.
Yes, I think it's important. Of course, what I mentioned in my remarks, it was the perspective from the Orthodox Church. This doesn't apply to others as well, in the same way. Sure. I just mentioned an example, but the sacrality, let's say, of the place is the religion itself. And and the people that gather. If there is just a place without any congregation, what is the purpose? What we are protecting? But I think also in the sense that when we are talking about any place of worship, it has the same importance, and we are safeguarding the religious, the religion and belief of the people, and also the space itself as a cultural heritage, because we have this aspect at the same time. Of course, you can tell me that there are, when worshippers are gathering in a space that is not considered neither as a temple or a mosque, it's a clandestine, in the ground floor or underground of a block of flats. Does it have the same need for protection? I would say yes. But there we have another aspect of what is legal and what is illegal. And there comes another, I think this is what Elisabetta could probably speak about.
Well, I know we're running low on time, but Mom Pallavicini, another witness.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this session and for the presentations. I was very happy to hear again this reference to respect the specificity of every different religious identity from Metropolitan Emmanuel, and on the other side link this to a more open-minded, universal respect of sacredness to be shared by different religious authorities, believers, and citizens, and governments maybe. I think and on the other side also, that this has nothing to do with syncretism, which is the confusion of all symbols, rituals, doctrines, and spiritual benefits. I think I just came back from a blessed meeting with your colleague, His Beatitude Theophilos III in Jerusalem. And I was not only blessed by this meeting, but during the meeting he asked that the charter of Khalifa Omar on Jerusalem was brought to be shown as a copy. And I was amazed of how he would make reference to this as a historical proof of trying to manage together the sacred spaces with respecting the specific also Christian situation under the jurisdiction of the former Islamic government. And I responded to this remembering that is a Muslim family has the heritage of the management of the keys of the Holy Sepulchre. Yeah. Although within our Islamic doctrine, Jesus has never died. He has never died. He's always alive spiritually, and so the idea of a sepulchre is not in the Islamic doctrine. But a Muslim family has the honor to have this responsibility and to as a service for the Christian management of this holy sacred space. I think this is also. I'm saying this because sometimes we forget the roots of historical examples, and we think we need to. Of course, we need to update them to the new context of a democratic, liberal, national society. And so, but I think this can help to see how there were already signs of interreligious cooperation in management of sacred spaces. Unfortunately, there has been also signs of what we witness now, which is, I think, the confusion of what I would call a apologetic, symbolic supremacy that uses symbols as a myth propaganda, and that is confused with some nationalistic agendas. So there is a great work that needs to be done. My last point would be for Elisabetta, because in Italy, a juridical challenge is that religious communities can find and sign an agreement with the secular Italian government on the management of their religious rights. There is an exception, which is that after the Second World War, the Christian Catholic churches are managed by the Christian Catholic National Church, but the property of the Christian Catholic Church is under a fund that is under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Interiors, il Fondo degli Edifici di Culto, which is interesting because this allows to the Christian management to pretend, if anything happens, that the property needs to be in somehow well managed by the Italian institutions. I don't know if this is a good example or a very Italian exception. The debate is this might also be a negative example because it's creating a double standard, because Jewish synagogues, Christian Orthodox and Christian Protestant or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu places of worship are not in this fund of religious churches, Christian Catholic churches. And so maybe your European project can provide some inspiration on how to have a shared management with the involvement maybe of the institutions, providing concrete help if some damage is, because you mentioned that there is also a juridical issue, but also a financial issue, because you have to then solve the issues in any kind. So we're just proposing this. Thank you.
Well, you want to?
Well, I can comment on this because the purpose of this project is exactly that we collect this data and to show to the Commission that everybody has an issue and that there needs to be equal compensation. And of course, because of church-state relations now, they are different in all these different European countries. The question is what Merete Bilde, that you know as well, who was posing the question, what about religion-state relations, because of the compensation, and because that is unfair. It's unfair. If community is in danger, if community needs help, the state needs to treat everybody equally and to be neutral in this regard, because everybody are contributing with the tax pay, with the, you know, like to the cultural life, to the business life of the society, and so on. And there needs to be some solution, and I hope that this consortium, because it's really first time that on European level we have this interfaith consortium who is really looking into that. What it's missing maybe a little bit in our consortium is to do a little bit more interfaith. But what Metropolitan Emmanuel said, okay, these lines, you know, like because of the canon law and of course line of syncretism, we have to watch out that this doesn't happen. But really in this provided frame that you have been mentioning and describing, we need to work. And this is a good frame. I don't see with all this, let's say, issues and having certain red lines that we cannot do more. On contrary, we can do much more.
Well, I'll give you the final word if I can, but we are out of time. But let me just say, early on in the discussion, we talked about having some helicopters that would jump over some of the barriers to some of these problems. We've just talked about having some keys to some of the problems, and those could be interfaith. I think this has suggested a number of ways that we can come at these very difficult issues, and it's sort of a real privilege for us to have one of the leaders on these issues with us. So I give you the final word.
Thank you, Professor. I just had to say thank you to Imam Pallavicini for the example he brought, and I think this Jerusalem is a unique place where we have, besides the religious, the culture as well, and all the history. And what you mentioned is that this temple, which has, of course, is under the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem, hosts Armenians, Catholic, Copts, Syriacs in the same space. The key for the entrance is with a Muslim family because of history, and but the whole set is viewed and secured by Israel, and we see there that the dialogue is an everyday process. The dialogue with the different communities that goes on, and the limits, the respect of those holy sites par excellence in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land, is very important. That's why we stress and that we have not to touch upon the laws that exist and the status of these sacred places and shrines should remain as they are. Otherwise, we lose everything, especially there. So thank you very much.
Well, please join me in thanking you.